Welcome back. You're watching To The Point. Yesterday, the Cabinet agreed to pass an ordinance amending the Mining and Minerals Development Regulation Act. This will be the 8th ordinance in under 8 months and the 5th since Parliament ended 2 weeks ago. So tonight we ask, is this widespread use of the ordinance facilities justified, or does it reveal an impatience with Parliament and perhaps an intolerance of the opposition? Also, what purpose does it serve? Does it really send out a clear message or just an indication of intent? My guests are Akali Dal MP Naresh Gujral, Congress MP Abhishek Singhvi, the political editor of The Hindu Verghese George, and the well-known Asian Age columnist Ashok Malik. Naresh Gujral, your government has been in power for less than 8 months, yet in that period you've passed 8 ordinances and 5 since Parliament ended 2 weeks ago. According to the Wall Street Journal, already your government is 6th out of 16 in the chart of ordinance use. Are you overusing ordinances?
Karan, did we have a choice? The way the opposition was hell-bent on derailing the development agenda, what choice does the government have? They were obstructing Parliament day after day after day.
Well, that's a fair point, Abhishek Singhvi. Let me put it squarely to you. The argument is that because the opposition and perhaps the Congress specifically held up the functioning of the Rajya Sabha, critical legislation couldn't be passed. So you left the government no option but to resort to the use of ordinances. If anyone's to blame, it's the opposition.
I'll tell you why it's a completely unfair point. In the last 10 years, statistics show that Parliament has never been disrupted more than by the BJP-led NDA opposition. Never before, statistically. In this session, and in the 2 sessions earlier since May 14, we've had 3 sessions, there has been exemplary performance of a much higher order than when the BJP was in opposition. In the last 10 days, purely on an ego and a mulish obstinacy, the Prime Minister, on matters of great national importance, of a divisive agenda, on issues arising day after day from Christmas holiday to Ghar Vapsi, refused to come and make a statement. He indeed came to the House once in a while, very rarely, despite a lot of foreign trips, but even when he came to the House, he refused to make a statement on this issue. Now, this is actually a completely created, provoked controversy arising out of obstinacy. Had the Prime Minister made a half an hour, 15-minute statement, this would not have arisen. So that's why I'm saying it was really, and give me half a minute more, Karan, it was really an intent to avoid parliamentary accountability. It was an intent to pass ordinances in 7 months, 8 ordinances, one after the other, and it's not the number, it's the subject matter on issues as important as insurance, other issues, all of them important issues. So there is no question, it's a created controversy.
Let me put you the central point made there by Abhishek Singhvi, that it was the Prime Minister's refusal to make a statement in the House on an issue that was of critical concern, not just to the Rajya Sabha, but the country, like conversions, or like the redesignation of Christmas as Good Governance Day, that led to this impasse. Should the Prime Minister have made it a prestige issue? Should he not instead have said, look, Parliament wants to hear me, I'll speak, and break the logjam?
See, 2 things. One, the opposition in the Rajya Sabha was largely led by the Trinamool Congress, and which is fighting the BJP in West Bengal, where it sees the BJP as its chief rival, and by the CPM, which opposes the insurance liberalization. If the Prime Minister had indeed made that statement, no doubt the Trinamool Congress would have found some other excuse to disrupt Parliament, because it is ideologically opposed to the insurance bill and wants to hold up the BJP's economic agenda because of political reasons, and it's within its rights too. It's the government's job to pass legislation, not the opposition's. This was as true for the UPA government as for the NDA government. It's within the government's right to explore a framework which is within the Constitution, which can be creative and is usually creative, but allows for its legislation to go through. So it's moved ordinance or issued ordinances which will need to be introduced in the Lok Sabha, passed by the Lok Sabha, and then passed by a joint session of Parliament if the Rajya Sabha doesn't take action on them or rejects them.
Well, let's then focus for a moment, Verghese George, on the actual future of these ordinances. I put it to you that they are unlikely to be cleared by the Rajya Sabha when it meets for the budget session. And I'm not just talking about the land acquisition ordinance. It's quite possible that even the insurance ordinance and coal mines might not be cleared by the Rajya Sabha. In which case, what purpose is served by passing ordinances now when you know that they won't be cleared when Parliament meets?
Well, on those points also there have been reports which I think may have originated from sources within the government, that the government might go in for a joint session of the Parliament, and if the joint session of the Parliament is also disrupted, the government could even consider expelling the disruptors from the session sitting and have the legislative agenda through. Therefore, the question is more fundamental than how they will manage to push through the legislative agenda through ordinances. I think the question is a broader one of what the way you framed it in the beginning, which is it actually a reluctance to engage the opposition? That, I think, is the case, and the government's action, regardless of what the explanations are, which I think could be largely true. I mean, nobody has a quarrel with the fact that there is a necessity to kickstart the economy. There are people who are waiting for jobs. The government cannot run away from their responsibility. Absolutely no two questions about it. But here, we are addressing how are we going to achieve it? Because the democratic processes in general, in principle, are time-taking, laborious, and often frustrating process. Are we going to then say that, okay, let us bypass all these things because I know how it is to be done, so I'll do it my way?
Well, in fact, let's take up that question, Naresh Gujral, of how you now going to convert these ordinances into bills. Because if you don't, they lapse. Now, the problem is, you're going to really have to do it through a joint session of Parliament. But for that, the bills either have to be defeated by the Rajya Sabha or passed by the Rajya Sabha in a version different to the Lok Sabha or held up for 6 months. Now, that means that of the 3 critical ordinances, and I'm talking about coal mines, land acquisition and insurance, only the insurance can go through in February. Coal mines and land acquisitions may well have to wait 6 months more. So once again I ask you, what purpose is served by passing the ordinances in a rush last week when you're not going to be able to convert them into bills, at least in 2 cases, for possibly 6 months more?
We are certain that we'll be able to convert them into acts. At the most, they will reject it. They will disrupt Parliament. They will not let us pass these bills. We will call for a joint session in that case. And if they try to disrupt the joint session, then we have our strategy in place.
Can I interrupt you there? The problem is you can't call for a joint session to pass land acquisition and coal mines unless either those are defeated in the Rajya Sabha or passed by the Rajya Sabha in a different shape and form to the Lok Sabha or held up for 6 months. Now, coal mines was only tabled in December. Land acquisition hasn't been tabled at all. So those two very likely will be held up for 6 months more.
Well, Karan, we are very clear on one thing. The country cannot be held to ransom. The economy has to move forward, come what may. If we have to again pass an ordinance, we shall do so. But we will not stop our agenda.
In other words, you're prepared to pass repeated ordinances till the ordinances turn into bills. Have I understood correctly?
I hope that the situation doesn't turn to that. But if opposition is obstinate, I guess we will have no choice.
On that, I want to ask you, Abhishek Singhvi, before I come back to my colleague here, Ashok Malik. If it comes to a joint session, will you continue to disrupt and therefore prevent legislation getting passed, running the possible risk of even being thrown out by the Speaker?
There's no question of speculating on that because I don't think we disrupted. I think the government created a situation where there was no other option but to demand that the Prime Minister comes first, otherwise the House can't function. But there are 2 very important points which have escaped the panelists, Karan, I want to bring them to your attention. A point was made by someone about Trinamool Congress. Even assuming that to be true, which I don't accept, there was rare unanimity between Trinamool and the CPM, between BSP and the SP. There was rare unanimity in every part of the Rajya Sabha except the BJP. And that is being forgotten. Okay, and that's not just the Trinamool agenda.
And the second point?
The second point is, that what is forgotten is that ordinance is created as a constitutional scheme as a rare exception. Now, just as you mentioned just now, that the land acquisition bill was never even brought to Rajya Sabha.
Yeah.
Where is the question of having an ordinance 1 week after?
I'll come to the question of urgency. I'm stopping you there. I'll come to the question of urgency, which is a constitutional requirement of ordinances in a moment's time. But first, let me come to you, Ashok Malik. You've given in an article that the Wall Street Journal published on the 31st of December a very convincing reason why the Prime Minister decided to go down the ordinance route, particularly in the case of land acquisition and insurance. You said that he's saying to the world that he's serious about reforms and he's prepared to stake his political credibility on them. True. And that may be an essential message for investors to hear. The problem is, will they accept the insurance as the final version and therefore start investing, or will they say, sorry boys, this is an intention and an intent, no more?
Two things, a very good point. One, it was important for the Prime Minister to show his intent and to show that he was still on the reformist path after what has been a fairly disastrous winter session for the government in terms of legislative advance. So one has to accept that. So he had to do something because the winter session was bad. Second, as far as I understand, and Mr. Singhvi, who's a distinguished lawyer, can confirm this, as far as I understand, according to a ruling by the Supreme Court, all investment decisions taken while the ordinance is in place stand even if the ordinance is then defeated. Which is why one company, a British company, I understand, has raised its insurance cap to 49%, according to this morning's newspapers. And I understand, yes,
into Max Bupa.
I didn't want to mention the name. And I understand that even if the ordinance lapses and we go back to 26% or whatever it is, that company's investment stands. That is my legal understanding of the law as it is.
A second quick question to you before I go to Naresh Gujral. To what extent has the ordinance route been taken, not just because the Modi government wants to send an unambiguous message about its commitment to reform, but also because it got very worried that in December it got sidetracked by the whole conversion issue as well as by the redesignation of Christmas, and that they wanted to dispel that and say, no, we're on track.
You are right in the sense that in December or November, December, the government did seem to lose control of the narrative because of identity and religious issues, some of them caused by Hindu nationalist groups, I understand that, and because in the Rajya Sabha in particular, it wasn't getting its way. So there was this assumption or presumption or perception rather that the government had lost its way and Mr. Modi was under siege, which he needed to dispel, and so he moved ahead with this slew of ordinances.
The ordinance is a stone that's killed several birds very conveniently.
Yes, it's a handy political tool.
Naresh Gujral, let's come to this constitutional requirement of ordinances, which is that they can only be issued when there's immediate need. Those are the exact words in the Constitution. Now, I can understand the case for coal mines, insurance, or land acquisition. In all three, you can argue that there is an immediate need of one sort or another. But what about the ordinance that the Cabinet agreed on last night to amend the Mining and Minerals Development and Regulation Act? What's the urgency for that? Why does that have to be done by ordinance?
Karan, before I answer this question, I'd just like to go back on why the parliament was disrupted. The congressmen and some people in the left felt that secularism was in danger. Now, that was sheer hypocrisy. Lok Sabha was functioning. I want to ask one question to my...
the answer Sitaram Yechuri gave famously. The tyranny of the majority in the Lok Sabha made the Lok Sabha function. So let's not get into contentious territory.
And it was the tyranny of the opposition in the Rajya Sabha that the entire development agenda was being derailed.
But come back to my point. Come back to my point, Naresh Gujral. What is the urgency that requires an ordinance to amend the Mining and Minerals Development and Regulation Act?
Because the government wants to send a very clear message to the investing community that every single act that is required,
but there's no immediate need here.
We will do by...
You may want to send a message to the community, but there's no immediate need. Aren't you in breach of the constitutional requirement?
No. Who decides whether there's an immediate need or not? Clearly the cabinet felt there is an immediate need.
Well, the president eventually, and that's where I want to bring in Abhishek Singhvi. Abhishek Singhvi, when it came to the land acquisition ordinance, the president consulted 3 ministers before he signed. Now, in the case of the Mines and Minerals Ordinance, will Congress approach the President not to give his consent on the grounds that the immediate need requirement is clearly not met in this instance?
Well, certainly it's obvious. I mean, we can write to the President, we can approach it. The President is himself, in a sense, a distinguished jurist. He understands that. But I want to make an additional point. This whole ordinance, which you have just now been seeing justified by the BJP and the NDA, is based additionally on disruption of Parliament. But where was the disruption? The Land Acquisition Act was never introduced. There is a different facet of urgency there, Karan. You had to introduce and find it.
Lost me technical details. I want to let me bring in Verghese George.
Let me make another point.
But don't keep jumping points. Don't keep jumping from one point to another. I'll come back to you later on. You keep your point for later on. Verghese George, I want to come back to this issue of whether the President will or might contest the question of urgency in the case of the mines and minerals. As you know, he was concerned about urgency in the land acquisition, but he got persuaded by 3 ministers. Now, so far, the President has not refused to sign an ordinance. He hasn't even asked the government to reconsider. But he does have those powers if he wants. What would happen and how embarrassing would it be if in the case of mines and minerals, the President were to say to the government, reconsider, I don't think an ordinance is needed?
See, in the absence of any information on that thing, I think it will be a little unwise on my part if I were to speculate how the President would react when it reaches him. But, and particularly given the fact that the definition of urgency or immediacy can have a subjective interpretation, including in the land acquisition case, maybe those provisions that you mentioned may have been immediate and urgent, but the way they have gone about a lot of other things were not really urgent. So the question of urgency and immediacy have some amount of subjectivity there. So if the government manages to convince the President on the urgency, I think he will sign it.
That's a very good point. That's a very good point. All the President has to be convinced of is the government's argument that this is urgent and immediate. The government, however, is unlikely to have a Rajya Sabha majority before the middle of 2016. It has a long list of economic agenda and reforms that it needs to pass, and they are critical. So does that mean that we're going to repeatedly resort to ordinances, then pass them through joint sessions thereafter?
Not necessarily, but I think the government is preparing for a worst case scenario where the Rajya Sabha is supremely uncooperative, but from its point of view, where it will have to introduce every legislation in the Lok Sabha, have the Lok Sabha pass it, then send it to the Rajya Sabha, wait for 6 months for the Rajya Sabha to do nothing in a worst case scenario, and then go to a joint session. What has happened with some pending bills is that they were introduced in the Rajya Sabha first. So still the Rajya Sabha passes it or defeats it, or well, passes it. It can't go to the Lok Sabha. So I think the government wants to reverse that and introduce all new bills, including these ordinances, in the Lok Sabha.
So that they can get over that particular problem. Let me put this to you, Naresh Gujral, and this may well have to be the last question I ask on this particular episode tonight. If you're going to have to repeatedly rule through ordinance because you can't get the opposition in the Rajya Sabha to support you, and then go to a joint session to get the ordinances converted into bills, is that a healthy precedent for Indian democracy? And that's a question you have to ask yourselves seriously, because as the government, you are the custodians of Indian democracy and the people who have to preserve the good traditions and practices of Parliament.
Karan, I agree with you that only if it is necessary should one call a joint session. But what choice do we have? If the opposition is hell-bent on disrupting Parliament, if they want to obstruct all legislative agenda, what does the government do? But I am sure public opinion will make Congress fall in line.
Okay.
As it is, they are receiving a drubbing election after election, and they can't afford to have public opinion against them all the time.
I want to give you the last word on that, Abhishek Singhvi, but I want to insist that you finish your last word in 30 seconds flat. Are you aware of the fact that the Congress party itself could suffer if you repeatedly look and seem as if you're holding up Parliament and forcing the government to resort to ordinance? So this is a high-risk game you're playing where you could lose as much as the government.
Not in the least. We don't think that at all. We are playing the role of a very responsible opposition. But what is important is this is legislation and policy making by stealth. You had the 31st December, I'll give you a very strong example of why it's by stealth and subterfuge. 31st December was the pretext given to the President for the urgency ground which you just mentioned. But in the guise of 31st December, which relates to one clause, the entire Land Acquisition Act has been changed by ordinance. That's the point I was trying to make when you interrupted me last time. Public purpose, consent, all this is beyond the 31st December 5 Act extension.
All right.
That was the reason given to the President, whereas you changed the Act completely.
In other
by
words,
ordinance.
the government was clever. It found a small opportunity to claim that there was an urgency and use that to pass a lot more that you claim wasn't urgent.
That's subterfuge.
Some would say that's subterfuge, as you do. Others would say that was very subtle, clever use of an opportunity, and hurrah to the government for doing so. You see, there are always two interpretations to every point. Yours, which is critical of the government, someone else's, not necessarily mine, by the way, which supports the government. But there we have to end it. This is an issue that's going to rankle and rage for many months to come, I suspect. My thanks to all my guests for joining me.